Today's shiur begins 16 lines from the bottom of Daf Lamed Zayin. Before we begin the actual Gemara, we glance at the side. In the margin, we have a nosei, a topic heading, which reads, Machloikis Tanoim, a Tanaic disagreement, Be'inyan Mikumom, regarding the location, Shel B'nai Shevet Levi, the members of the tribe of Levi, B'ma'amad HaBrochos VaHaKlolos BaHaGrizim VeAvol, with regard to the occasion of the national curses and blessings at Mount Gerizim and Avol. This, of course, is a topic that we have been involved with in our recent shiurim, and we now turn to the Gemara text. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Ef Shalom Levi Lamata. You can't say that Levi was located down below between the two mountains. Shikvar Ne'emar Lamala, because there is reference to them being above. And as the Gemara says, it's already been said they're above, so you can see Rashi on the fourth line from the top, Shikvar Ne'emar Levi Lamala, Moshe Kosa B'Torah, Elu Yam Levorech. In the Torah, the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, it is written that the Torah enumerates the tribes that will be on Har Gerizim, and in the list it says, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. V'i efshar, we continue in the Gemara, V'i efshar lomar lamala, and on the other hand, you can't say that they were in fact above on the mountain, shikvar ne'emar lamata, because it says that they were down below. And Rashi points out that in Sefer Yoshua, in the book of Joshua, Perek Ches Posuk Lamed Gimel, and Rashi quotes it, and we can read the Rashi together on the third narrow line. It says, V'chol Yisrael uzekenav oimdim mizeh u'mizeh lo'oroi neged ha'kohenim v'alevim. From that pasuk you see that the kohenim and levim were together with the Aron, which was the holy ark. Alma kohenim levim lamato. The holy ark was located down below between the two mountains. So how do we resolve the seeming discrepancy? So the Gemara goes on, Ha Ketzad, how is this to be therefore understood? Zikne Kahuna Levi Lamata, the elders of the Kohanim and Leviim were down below, Vashar Lamalo, and the rest of the tribe of Levi, of course including the Kohanim, they were above. Rabbi Yoshia Omer, Kol Haroi L'Shores Lamato, Vashar Lamalo. All those Leviim that were of age to perform their, Levitical service. And when we speak about Levitical service, this is a reference to their carrying the different articles associated with the Mishkan. And that happens to be between ages 30 and 50. And all of that is pointed out in the Torah. So those are the Roi L'Shoris. L'Shoris means to serve, but serve in that capacity of carrying the Aron. They were Lamata. Vash'ar Lamala. All the rest, younger than 30 and older than 50, were above. Rebbe Omer, Elu va'elu lamata hein omdin. This is a new approach. We haven't seen the likes of this before, but according to Rebbe, everybody was in fact down below. There was no one on the mountains. Let's read that again. Elu va'elu lamata hein omdim. They were all down below. As far as the reference to the tribes that were associated with the blessing at Gerizim, Hafchu Penehem Klape HaGerizim Upaschu B'Bracha. Those tribes that were enumerated in the context of Har Gerizim would turn toward the Har Gerizim and enunciate the bracha, the blessings that are spelled out in the Torah. And Klape Har Eval Upaschu B'Klala. And those that were associated with the curse would face the Mount Aval and recite the curses. Now, according to Rebbe, then how do you explain the psukim that make reference to Al Har Gerizim and Al Har Aval? On. Al usually means on top of. So my Al, what does Al of the pasuk mean? And you can see this in Dvarim Perek Chav Zayin pasuk Yud Beis. What does that mean? Al equals besamuch. Al can also mean next to. Kedesanya. And here we have a Tanaic source in which Rebbe appears. It's not related to Grizim and HaRav, but the word Al is referred to. And this pasuk that opens this particular source deals with the Lechem Haponim, the showbreads, the 12 loaves that were stationed in the Heichal of the Beis HaMikdash and of the Mishkan. And there was a spice called Levona Zaka, pure Levona, that was in receptacles, in containers that were together with the showbreads. Now, where were the containers of Levona actually placed? Were they placed on top of the breads? Well, the pasuk says, "V'nosata al hamareches Levona Zaka." Mareches is the stack of breads. The Levona Zaka, the pure Levona spice, was V'nosata al, would mean was placed al. Rebbe Omer al equals besamach. Al means next to. And therefore, to understand the setup of the showbreads were in two stacks on a golden table in the Heichal. And on not literally on top of the breads, rather, but next to them on the table surface, there were the receptacles of the pure Levona. And that is what Rebbe sees in the word al. V'nosata al means next to the mareches, next to the stack of breads. Ata oimer al equals besamuch eino elo al mamish. You're saying that al means besamuch. Maybe it means literally on top of. Well, we have a precedent. We have another source where the word al clearly means next to and not on top of. Kishu omer v'sachoisa al ha'oron. Now, that pasuk is a reference to the division, the curtain in the Mishkan that separated the Heichal section from the Holy of Holies. And it says there was, the parochus was v'sachoisa, usually has to do with a covering. However, it can't mean that over here, because if you say that the parochus was covering the Oron, that simply wasn't true. It was next to the Oron. It was a curtain that divided. So, Hevi Omer, from this pasuk you therefore conclude, Al equals besamuch. So that, true, elsewhere in the Torah the word Al doesn't mean next to, but in this case, by the paroches, and by the Levona Zaka, and Rebbe Lashitaso, with regard to the members of the nation of Israel, by Har Grizim and Har Eval, they were next to the mountains, down below, between them, and not literally on top of them. Before we continue in the Gemara, we glance at the side. We have a new topic heading, and we also indicate the length of this is Ad Sofam at base. We have a long topic, and what we've entitled it is Bracha Uklola Bichlal Uprat Va'od. The sugya, this Gemara, is going to make reference to the blessings and the curses. And you find that in addition to specific blessings and curses, there's also a general blessing and curse that you find in amongst the psukim. And all of this, these numbers, are in addition to the fact that there are 613 mitzvos in the Torah. So this piece of Gemara is going to in fact be a very number-oriented Gemara. And we're going to discuss, in general, the idea of a covenant that the Almighty makes with Klal Yisrael. A covenant, a pact, a treaty, whereby the Am Yisrael is bound to keeping the Torah. And we're going to find that this pact, this treaty, extends beyond the simple counting of 613 mitzvahs, because within each mitzvah we'll find that there is a blessing associated with one who fulfills the mitzvahs, there's a curse for one who does not fulfill the mitzvahs, there is a general concept and a specific concept that applies. I realize that this sounds a bit abstract, and I'm afraid to say that by the time we get to the end of the sugya, there's an element of the abstract that I think is going to remain at this level of understanding of our Daf Yomi Gemara marking shiur, but we'll try our best to at least convey some idea with regard to what we're going to learn. So now we continue in the Gemara text. Tanu Rabbanon, Boruch Bichlal, Boruch Befrat, Oru Bichlal, Oru Befrat, Lilmoid Ulilamed, Lishmor Velasois, Harei Arba. You notice we've counted that with regard to each mitzvah, there's a mitzvah to Lilmod, to learn about it. There's a mitzvah to teach it. There's a mitzvah to not violate. And there is a mitzvah to fulfill. Of course, as you can see, we've numbered Lilmoid, Lilamed, Lishmor, Velasos. Those are 4 elements. We glance at the Rashi, a little less than halfway down. Boruch Bichlal, Boruch Befrat. Kol ha-brochos va-klolos, Nemru bahar grizim bahar eval, Bichlal uprat. All of the blessings and curses that were uttered at Mount Grizim and Eval were stated in a general and in a specific fashion. And Rashi explains, Baruch Asher Yokim es Divrei HaTorah Hazos, Orur Asher Lo Yokim. These are psukim that you can see in the Chumash, and those are general psukim. Blessed be the one who fulfills all of the Torah, and the opposite as well, Harei Bichlal. Those are general statements. V'chol achas v'achas befrat. Baruch v'orur. Example, each one of the mitzvahs appears also in a particular fashion, both positive, a blessing and a curse. Baruch asher lo yaseh pesel masecha. Blessed be one who desists, who avoids, who refrains from making molten images, idolatrous figures. Orur asher yaseh pesel masecha. Cursed be one who does make those images. V'chein kulanin, and likewise each one of them, each one of the mitzvahs that are enumerated at Har Grizim and Har Eval are in a positive and in a negative. The Rashi goes on, Lilmoid ulalamed lishmor velasos, kol ha-mitzvahs kulan, all of the mitzvahs of the Torah, tu'unos arba'o ele, ulemaditem osam. Ulemaditem means you shall learn them. Ushmartem, that's what we said was lishmor, la'asosam. The pasuk says, let's read that again, ulemaditem oisam, ushmartem la'asoisam. Those are 3 elements, uksiv, and elsewhere, in what we're familiar with is the Kriya Shema, it says, v'limaditem oisam es benechem. You shall teach them to your children. Harekan arba mitzvahs l'chol mitzvah. You can see, therefore, with regard to each mitzvah, any given mitzvah, you have 4 commandments that accompany each mitzvah, each commandment. V'al arba'al son nimseru orur uboruch bichlal uprat. And with regard to each one of them, with regard to each one of these, we'll say these 4 elements, you have the curse and blessing for either the violation or the fulfillment. And you have that in a klal uprat fashion. Baruch asher yilmedu, oru asher lo yilmedu. V'chein lelamed, v'chein lishmor, v'chein lasos. This blessing and curse you find with regard to each one of those elements. B'chol echad arba brisos. In each one, for example, the mitzvah of learning about a mitzvah. So there's a command to learn the mitzvah, and then there's a blessing and curse with regard to one who does fulfill that or doesn't. And you have that in also a general blessing and curse. So with regard to each element of the 4 that we mentioned, Lilmoid, Lishmor, Lasos, Ulamed, you have 4 blessings and curses. Bris leBoruch Bichlal, Bris leBoruch Befrat. Bris laOra Bichlal, Bris laOra Befrat. The Gemara in a moment is going to continue with the calculation, but before we read the text, let's go over the calculation on our own. Take, for example, the obligation to study a mitzvah, lilmod. Regarding that point, how many covenants are there? The covenant being a reference to the blessing and curse. Well, regarding lilmod, you have a specific blessing and curse and a general blessing and curse. So there are 4 elements of bris, of covenant associated with lumod, and likewise with lamed, lishmor, and lasos. So with regard to each one, there are 4 elements, and there are 4 commands. So it's 4 times 4. That means that there are, we'll say, 16 covenants with regard to any one mitzvah. Later in the Gemara, you're going to see that the establishment of a covenant took place in 3 locations. So you'll end up calculating 3 times 16 will be there 48 covenants. Let's now continue in the Gemara text. We're continuing at the top of Amud Beis after enumerating the 4 commands with regard to each mitzvah and the 4 covenants associated with each one. So we say Harei Arba. That the Harei Arba is a reference to the 4 specific commands. And then Arba v'Arba Harei Shmoina. U'Shmoina Harei Sheshesrei. This is what we explained already. Before we go on, let us again look at Rashi. Now Rashi you'll find is out of place. Namely, the Rashi that's relevant to the top of Amud Beis is found at the lower part of Amud Aleph. So let's continue reading the Rashi together. Arba v'Arba, Arba brisois lilmoid, v'Arba lilamed, Harei Shmoina. There are 4 covenants, and we said before that's a reference to the Boruch Bichlal and the Boruch Befrat, Or Bichlal and Or Befrat. So there are 4 covenants that are associated with the commandment of studying a mitzvah. V'Arba lilamed, Harei Shmoina. That accounts for 8. Shmoina ha'ika oid shmoina lishmor v'lasos. So as we said before, that accounts for 16 covenants with regard to any one mitzvah. Let's continue in the Gemara. V'chein, we're at the second line from the top of Amud Beis. V'chein b'Sinai, v'chein ba'arvoi smoyov. This repeats itself at Sinai and in Arvoi Smoyov. So, chronologically, though, of course, the first group of 16 was actually the latest event. That took place in the time of Yoshua at Har Grizim and Har Eval. So we counted for the first 16 by referring to what you will find at Har Grizim and Har Eval. Of course, that was prophesied in the Chumash itself. And the same thing applies to Mount Sinai and Arvos Moav, the last speech of Moshe Rabbeinu before he died, before the Jews crossed into Eretz Yisrael. Shenemar, the Pasuk says, Eile divrei habris asher tzivo Hashem es Moshe, and we have the continuation of the Pasuk included on the side. It continues to say, Lichrois es b'nei Yisrael be'eretz Moav, milvan habris asher koras itam b'chorev. So in this Pasuk, you see references to Arvos Moav and Chorev. Chorev is Mount Sinai. The continuation of this line in the Gemara, Rashi on Amud Aleph says we are not going to include in the Girsa, so we skip to the next line in the middle. Nimtza Memches, it's 48, Brisos al kol mitzvah u'mitzvah. You find, therefore, 48 covenants with regard to each one of the mitzvos. And that's a result of adding up 16 3 times from Grizim, Sinai, and Arvos Moav. Reb Shimon motzi har Grizim v'har Eval umachnis oyel moed shebemidbar. Reb Shimon has a same final number but a different calculation in terms of how to get to that number. He says you take har Grizim and Har Eval out of the list and replace it with the oyel moed, the Mishkan in the Midbar. And the Mishkan in the Midbar, you find a reference to this multi-covenant episode. According to Reb Shimon, the locations are as follows. You have Sinai, Arvos Moav, and Oyel Moed. Notice, according to Reb Shimon, no reference to Har Grizim. According to the Tanakama, you had a reference to Har Grizim, you have a reference to Sinai, and a reference to Arvos Moav. Therefore, according to the Tanakama, Sinai and the Oyel Moed are essentially one and the same. It's not that there were two separate events. The Gemara on that point continues, Ubeplukta Dehani Tanoi. The machlokes that we just saw, Rabbi Shimon and his Tanakama and the previous opinion, parallel a machlokes that we're going to see now between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shmuel oimer, Klolois nemru b'Sinai uprotois bo'el moed. As far as Rabbi Shmuel is concerned, at Mount Sinai, you didn't have details of mitzvahs. You have just general statements of mitzvahs. Where do you find the details of mitzvahs, according to Rabbi Shmuel? In the Oyel Moed. These opinions, by the way, are all based on different understandings of psukim. And as far as Rabbi Yishmael is concerned, because Sinai is really, we'll say, half the story, you'd have to combine Sinai and Oyel Moed to get to one total picture of klolos, general statements, and details. So as far as that is concerned, Rabbi Shmuel will parallel the Tanakama from before. From the Tanakama before, we mentioned, he makes reference to Sinai, doesn't make a separate reference to Oyel Moed, because as far as that Tanakama is concerned, Sinai is to be understood as a place of klolos and protos only when combined with the Oyel Moed. We continue in the Gemara. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Klolos uprotos nemru b'Sinai. Notice the difference. As far as Rabbi Akiva is concerned, Sinai is a standalone. The Klolos and protos were all stated there. V'nishnu b'Oyel Moed, and they were repeated in Oyel Moed. So Oyel Moed is a separate location of the total picture. V'nishtalshu, and a third time ba'arvois moyov. And that having been said, you can see that Rabbi Akiva parallels Rabbi Shimon that we saw just before. V'ein l'chol kol dvar mitzvah u'mitzvah sheksuva b'Torah shelo nichlusu oleo arboim u'shmoina brisos. This is the first time we're seeing what we've been alluding to orally, that every mitzvah of the Torah. How many mitzvahs are in the Torah? There's 613 mitzvahs in the Torah. Well, each mitzvah of the Torah has accompanying it 48 brisos, 48 covenants. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Ish Kfar Akko, Omar Mishum Rabbi Shimon, Ein L'cha Mitzvah u'Mitzvah Shiksu B'Torah, Shelo Nichrusu Oleh Arboim U'Shmoina Brisos, Shel Sheish Meos Elef U'Shloishes Alofim V'Chomesh Meos V'Chamishim. Each mitzvah of the Torah has 48 covenants, and those 48 covenants are multiplied by 603,550. That's we'll say the census population of the Jews at the time of their sojourn in the Midbar. Of course, that's a number that reflects men from between the ages of 20 and 60. There were actually many more, but this is the number that we often use when referring to the size of the Jewish people based on the census that you see in the Torah. Omar Rebbe, L'divrei Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Ish Kfar Akush, Omar Mishum Rabbi Shimon. The statement that Rebbe is going to make now is going to sound very much like that which immediately preceded Rebbe. In the Gemara, after this Tanaic source, we'll be asking what's the difference between these two opinions. So in the meantime, if you feel you're not seeing something new, then you're seeing things quite correctly. So Rebbe says that according to this Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Ein l'chol kol mitzvah mitzvah shebetorah shelo nichus oleo arboim u'shmoina brisos shel sheish meos elef v'shloishes alofim v'chomesh meos v'chamishim. There's no single mitzvah in the Torah that doesn't have these 48 covenants times 603,550. Nimtza l'chol echad ve'echad miYisrael. The result of this is that every Jew has 600,000 My binayu. What does Rebbe, in this source we call him opinion number 2, what does he add? And what is the point of the machlokes? If he's saying exactly the same thing, he wouldn't appear in a source. Source doesn't give you multiple names just for the sake of listing names unless there's a point of difference between them. Omar Rav Misharshia. Rav Misharshia explains, Arva the Arva Ika Binayu. The concept of Arvus is mutual responsibility. In other words, every person has an obligation to take care of himself. That has nothing to do with mutual responsibility. So every individual Jew has the obligation to fulfill the 613 mitzvahs, and each mitzvah has accompanying it these, we'll say, these 48 covenants. What these opinions are arguing about is further than that. Every individual Jew has a minimum level of arvus, meaning that I have to see to it, I have to be concerned with the fulfillment of every other Jew, so that in addition to my own responsibility, whatever that can be multiplied 603,550 times. That's my responsibility to see to it that each other Jew fulfills his mitzvahs. Now the question is, do I have a responsibility to make sure that my fellow Jew carries out his responsibility with regard to the next Jew? That's called arva v'arva. My arvus, my responsibility to oversee that the next Jew exercises his arvus with regard to every other Jew. The numbers become fantastic here when you start multiplying to find out how much responsibility each one of us carries on our shoulders. We take a look in the Rashi, who explains. The Rashi we'll look at together is in the middle of the Omer of Mishar, Arva v'arva di arva. Imnase kol echad orev al arvuso shel chavero olo. Does every Jew have a responsibility with regard to the arvus, the responsibility of him, the next Jew, to oversee his fellow Jews? Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Sovar, that's the first opinion. Lo naaseh kol echad orev al chavero elo shishmuru es hamitzvos. My responsibility is simply with regard to the next Jew himself fulfilling the mitzvahs. Nimsa kol echad echad orev al memches, that's 48 brisos, shel kol echad ve'echad. Avol lo naaseh kol echad ve'echad orev al arvus shel chavero elo al choivoso shel chavero. My obligation, my responsibility is simply to make sure that the next Jew fulfills his own personal responsibility of mitzvah fulfillment. The also Rebbe Lememar, with Divrei Rebbe Shimon Shebo Limno, says Brisos Ha'arvus. Rebbe, who is the second opinion in his interpretation of Rebbe Shimon, he says, well, once you get into an obligation with regard to mutual responsibility, Yesh lo limnois arboim u'shmoina brisos shel shishim ribo l'chol echad. You have to count the 48 covenants. Shishim ribo is a reference to the 603,550 number. It's simply said in this, we'll say, short phrase of shishim ribo. U'b'chol echad ha'ela yesh shishim ribo shekulam nisarvu zeh bozeh al choivosam ve'al harvusam. So that my responsibility is not limited to making sure that my fellow Jew carries out the mitzvahs for himself, but also I have to make sure that he makes sure that every fellow Jew carries out the mitzvahs. Nimtza kol echad mekabelov arvus shel shishim ribo b'shvil choyvus shel chaver v'chol echad mishishim ribo halolu kibel alav brisos shishim ribo b'shvil arvus shenis arvu ochiv al chaverehem v'zeh kibel alav af arvus shel arevim. So Rashi explains what we have already said orally. We turn back to the Gemara. There's a point. It takes a few lines to develop. Dorash Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani miturgimonei de Rebbe Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani, he was the miturgimon. He was the one who would recite to the public the teachings of Reb Shimon Lakish. So when Reb Shimon Lakish would say a lecture, he would say it in a low voice, and Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani would hear it and say it over for the larger public. So this Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani, on his own, he said, Kol aparsha kula lo nemra ela b'noyef v'noyefes. The list of psukim, of blessings and curses that you find in Dvarim, Perek Chav Zayin, Pasuk Tezvav, which we associate with the blessings and curses of Har Grizim and Har Eval, they're actually one topic, and that is the prohibition of adulterous relations. Orur ho'ish asher yaseh pesul masecha v'chulei. And my understanding of the Gemara is here, he's strengthening his point, because in the list of psukim, it says that cursed be the one who makes a molten image. Now, a curse is certainly a negative thing, but there are more, we'll say, catastrophic things than an orur. An orur, as we said, is a curse. It's at least a slap on the wrist. But as I said, there are more serious ways of expressing indignation and retribution and punishment for offenses. So when you read this pasuk of making molten images, which is idolatry, you could react, Ba'orur sakilei. This is a rhetorical type question. Is a mere curse enough? Someone who's involved in idolatry, he's kafir bikr, he's denying the Almighty. Is orur enough? And yet that's what the Torah says. Ella, so it must be that the pasuk of orur isha sheyaseh pesach masecha is not to be understood on its literal or simple, superficial basis. So what does the pasuk refer to? What Rav Yehuda bar Nachmani said. Elazeh habal erva v'hoylid ben. The pasuk is describing a person that had an incestuous relationship, and a child was born. That child is a mamzer. Now, a mamzer is restricted from marrying people from the Jewish community. So he was, let's say, emotionally pressed or forced to leave his immediate surroundings. So he leaves his Jewish community, goes to a Gentile community, a place of idolatry. And this illegitimate child goes off to an idolatrous Gentile community and goes and practices avodah zarah, practice idolatry. Cursed be his parents that caused that to be. So when you read the pasuk, it says, "Cursed be a man who makes a molten image." So there is an association with idolatry, but we're not referring to the actual practice of idolatry. We're cursing the parents that had of this illegitimate child, of this mamzer, this male and female that had this adulterous, incestuous relationship, producing a child that goes off and practices idolatry. The curse, therefore, is focused on the parents who brought him into being. Those parents themselves didn't practice idolatry, but they brought about a person that did. and they, the parents, are the subject of the pasuk, strengthening what Rav Yehuda Bar Nachmani said, that the verses in Dvarim Perek of Zion pasuk Tezvav, those curses and blessings, the curses are what's actually spelled out, they are all related to the topic of immoral, of incestuous relations. You might be asking, well, we just explained one of the psukim. What about all the other psukim? So, if you're interested, and I hope you are, I highly encourage looking into the Rashi, who spells out many of the psukim, and even though, as I said, regarding this pasuk, it will apply to many of the others. How do you take a pasuk that says, for example, cursed be the one who causes a blind man to stumble? How do you associate that with adulterous relations? Rashi shows how that is done. Let's continue in the Gemara. Tonu Rabbanan. V'nosata es habrocha al hagrizim v'saklolav chulei. Ma Talmud lomar. What is the purpose of having this pasuk in Dvarim Perek Yud Aleph? To tell me about the brocha is on hargrizim and the clothes harevel? Im lalamed shtei brocha al hargrizim klol al harevel. If that's the purpose of the pasuk, harei kfar nemar. That's already reported elsewhere. That's in Dvarim Perek Chav Zayin. Eile yamdu levorach esom al hargrizim uksiv eile yamdu al haklolo baharevel. So the actual location of where the blessings and where the curses took place, that's taken care of in Perek Chav Zayin. Why the pasuk from Perek Yud Aleph? Ela, the pasuk from Perek Yud Aleph that opened up this Tanaic source, lahakdim bracha leklola, to have the blessing uttered before the curse. Yachol you kol habrachos koidmos leklolos. Does that mean, therefore, that you should read a list of blessings before you even start the list of curses? Talmud lomar bracha uklola. The pasuk makes reference to them individually. Bracha achas kedemes leklola. One bracha precedes one klola, one curse. And likewise, in an alternating fashion, the next one, a bracha, and then the curse. V'ein kol habrachos kodmos leklolos. And one is not to recite the list of blessings in its entirety before reading the curses. Ulahakish bracha leklola. And another point that's derived from this pasuk in Dvarim Perek Yud Aleph is to compare bracha to klola. Lo maloch. And here we have a number of points that appear in a series form. On the side of the Gemara, we have a nosei / mivneh heading. The double underline points out Dvarim shenilmadu me'ahekish bein habrachos haklolos ba'agrizim ve'eval. What do we derive from this comparison? Ma klola b'leviim, af bracha b'leviim. Just like the curse, it's stated explicitly, is recited by the Levites, so too the blessing. Uma klola b'kol ram, af bracha b'kol ram. And just like the klola is done in a loud, audible voice, so too the bracha. Uma klola b'lashon hakodesh, af bracha b'lashon hakodesh. And just like the curse is done in Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, so too the blessing, the Lashon HaKodesh. Uma klola b'chlal uprat, and just like the curse is stated in a general form and a specific form, af bracha b'chlal uprat. Ma klola elu v'elu oinin v'imrim amen, and just like with regard to the curse, all of the people, the tribes that were associated with Grizim and the tribes associated with Hareval, answer in affirmation, they say by saying Amen, af bracha, elu v'elu oinin v'oimrim amen. So too with regard to the brachos. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.